Kovacic with the Historical Society of Carroll County. Earlier this year, we were happy to begin an evening lecture series called Talks of the Tavern to be held at historic Hscc Tavern on our campus on Main Street. The launching of the talks was a result of a membership survey. Our membership suggested that we offer events in the evening for those who couldn't make it to our daytime series, talk series, our box lunch talks that are scheduled at noon every third Tuesday of the month. Our first talk and only talk Tavern thus far this year was held in February, featuring Warren Dorsey and Jack White. And we had a great crowd come out despite the cold weather, and we all enjoyed a magnificent talk about local history. Tonight, it is our great pleasure to continue offering our talks at the Tavern, just not at the Tavern. Our speaker, Jay Graybill, will be Zooming from the Carroll County Chamber of Commerce office, courtesy of Mike McMullen. Jay's talk, Owing to the Confusion and Excitement of the Battle of Antietam, is about his great-great-grandfather's 36-year legal fight to recover damages from the Union Army's destruction of his crops during the Antietam and Gettysburg campaigns. As before I continue, I want to thank our partners in making this presentation possible. The Community Media Center. They've always been fantastic, and since we've started these virtual talks, you can feel their professionalism. They have great advice, and they've just been fantastic partners from the beginning. And we'd like to also thank the Carroll County Chamber of Commerce, Mike McMullen, for allowing us to use his office, his laptop, and their Ting high-speed internet connection. So we've muted everyone's audio for the speaker's presentation, but just to make sure there are no disruptions, please turn off your microphone and video. Both toggles are found in the lower left-hand corner of your Zoom screen. We also recommend using active speaker view. On the top right of your Zoom screen, if you see the word speaker, you are fine. If you see gallery, click on it and switch to speaker. This way, the speaker will be the largest window on your screen. Because we're recording this for future use, please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. But I'll go over the instructions now. In Zoom, you can ask questions two ways. To raise your hand, move your mouse to the bottom of the Zoom window and a menu will appear. Top of the screen if you're using an iPad. Tap on the participant button and that'll bring up a list of participants. At the bottom of the participant list, you will see a raise hand box. Click on that and then you'll see a dialog box asking you to allow us to unmute you. Click yes, and your mic will be unmuted so that you can ask your question. Or you can use the chat box feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen to type in your question, which I will read out loud. In chat, you can send a message to everyone or use the pull-down menu to send a message to a single participant. And I'll review these instructions at the end of today's presentation as well. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Jay Graybill. Jay works at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. During his time there, Jay was a recipient of the Army Achievement Medal for Civilian Service in 2009 and the Army Commander's Award for Civilian Service in 2004 and 2005. Jay is a native of Carroll County and lives here in Westminster. He's also a fantastic executive director for the Historical Society of Carroll County from 1994 to 2002. He is currently a board member and we are glad to have him. And now I will turn the presentation over to Jay. I hope you all enjoy. Thanks very much for joining.
Well, good evening, everyone. As I was sitting here watching the people join our meeting, I recognized a lot of names. It's good to see all of you, at least virtually. I'm sorry we're not in the Tavern tonight, but I think this virtual program is going to be a great venue for the Historical Society many years in the future. And tonight I want to tell you a family story. I will explain the title, Owing to the Confusion and Excitement Attending to the Battle of Antietam. It's a historic quote that I found when I was doing research at the National Archives in Washington. And I'll tell you that story a little bit later. But as I say, this is a family story. It's a little bit about me. It's a little bit about several generations of my family. It all revolves around the Battle of Antietam, September 17th, 1862. A little background on me, on family history. I did have one ancestor who did serve in the Civil War. He was a Confederate soldier from Virginia, and unfortunately was captured in battle, went to a prisoner of war camp. All of them were very bad experiences for prisoners. And he was released in very poor condition, and he died walking home to his family. His children were widowed. His wife had died during the war. And my grandmother, I was giving a talk one time at a family gathering, and she had passed by then. But one of my aunts told me that she said she never knew that darn Yankees was two words until she was 13. And she said it in a little more earthy terms. But that conflict has had lasting effects. And as I say, in my family, it was one ancestor who did pass during the war. And others on my mother's side of the family, mostly what I'll be talking about is the Antietam story. So we'll get going through the slides here. Hey, this is the banner that hung on the grandstand at the Antietam South Mountain Centennial in September 1962, on the 100th anniversary. And I attended a lot of those events. It was the 1st through the 14th of September 1962. So I won't have to tell you how old I am. You'll see it in the next slide. But as a young fellow, I got hooked on history. And I don't know how many of you in the audience, I think you probably have an interest in history. Is there a defining event that got you interested? Well, this was the event for me, September in 1962. And at this event, there was a grandstand. I was sitting there with my grandfather, much more about him later. And we watched the reenactment at Bloody Lane on the battlefield, which they don't do anymore. This was the last time I think they've ever had something on the battlefield of that nature. And after that event was over, he handed me this banner, and I've kept it all those years since 1962. This is what the best dressed future historians wore in 1962. You'll notice I have a gray kepi on. He probably had a choice of buying me a blue one or a gray one, and my grandfather bought me the gray one, and I'm wearing a bunch of buttons, and I still have the buttons. One funny story I want to tell you, I was sitting in the grandstand with my grandfather, and there was another fellow sitting on the other side, an older gentleman, his age, and he asked me, he said, "Boy, were your ancestors Yankees or were they rebels?" And I was only 6, and I had no idea which was. So whatever answer I gave was wrong. So he says to me, "Darn it, boy," he says, "those are the fellows who shot off my leg." And I started to apologize. I was very embarrassed. And this gentleman's wife gave him an elbow in the ribs and said, "Stop picking on that boy and give him a quarter." So the first veteran I ever met and the first story I ever heard, I got a quarter for it. So it was a start of a long career. That's the button, which of course I still have. And I still have the gray kepi. I think what's interesting about this is you look at the Antietam generals that it purports to show. There's Robert E. Lee with the white beard and the gray. But the gentleman on the right is Jesse Reno, who was killed at South Mountain, a Union general. And it's not McClellan who faced Lee at Antietam. I think it's just interesting that they didn't pick McClellan to show him on the button. Well, this is my grandfather, just a little bit older than me than in the picture I just showed you. His name was Myron Lee Bloom. And Lee was a family name adopted as a middle name for his father. And his father, before him, I'll tell you a story about him later, was involved in the American Civil War. So this is Myron Lee. I don't know what the event was. It was probably taken about 1905. And he was an interesting man. He was a school teacher. He was a high school principal about the time of World War I. Then got involved into the Maryland legislature, served a couple terms, I think 4 terms in the House of Delegates, and then got involved with the centennial of the Civil War in the 1960s. This is a picture of my grandfather on the left, his sister on the right, and that's my mother, probably taken in the late 1940s. They're at the McKinley Monument on Antietam Battlefield. This is up above the Burnside Bridge, and McKinley was a sergeant in Company E of the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry at Antietam. And on this monument, there's a bronze plaque showing him giving food and coffee to the troops. And on the monument, it says, "While in charge of the commissary department, on the afternoon of the day of the Battle of Antietam, September 17, 1862, personally and without orders, served hot coffee and warm food to every man in the regiment. And on this spot, so had to pass under fire." So this is a picture, again, there at the living in Washington County at the time and visiting the Antietam battlefield. This is one of the fun things of doing this project. I went through a lot of family archives and pictures and documents, and then did some research outside at most of the National Archives that I'll share with you this evening. This was my grandfather's country store in a little town called St. James, Maryland. There's a railroad track that runs by it. This was a kid's paradise for me. When I was a young fellow, I would go and stay a week at their old Victorian house, which is just off the picture to the left. But we'd go down and I'd spend time in this country store. And there was a kerosene pump outside. They sold molasses. They sold candy, penny candy. And I just had a great time playing in the store. It was a community center, and everybody came there to get their mail. He was the postmaster, and they would come pick up their mail and tell stories. So I'll show you an interior, which has a picture of my grandmother. This is Goldie Puffin. And Puffin was a family name, and it's very much associated with Antietam. There's 5 Puffin farms on the battlefield proper. This is inside that store. They had the old potbelly stove that I got to put coal in, and we would just sit around and tell stories, and I'd listen to these people telling about what life was a long time ago as a little fellow growing up in the 1960s. It was just a great place to grow up. And again, helping me understand what I want to do with a career. I was going to work with history, and I was going to work with artifacts, and that's what I've had a wonderful time doing in a career. This is a map showing the area of the Antietam battlefield that I'm going to talk about where my family was involved. And I can use the mouse here to highlight at the top of our map is the property name of Jacob Poffenberger. He's my ancestor's father. And they lived north of the battlefield near Bakersville. And then we go to the bottom of the map, there's Sharpsburg. And then right in the center where it says Signal Station, there's a couple properties right there. I'm moving their mouse around. I hope you can see that clearly. This is where most of the action I'll talk about takes place. And I have a little bit close up later. But from Jake Poffenberger's farm down to the southern part where the sunken road took place, that's the area of my story for tonight. So it was about a mile north and south, and we're going to tell some stories about some of the people involved in that area. This is a more modern map that shows what the foliage was like at Antietam, where the original fields were, where the woods were, and so forth. A little bit closer, you can see an M. Miller. That's a neighbor. And then this little black dot right here to the left is Samuel Poffenberger's farm. And he's a great uncle. He's a brother of my ancestor, Henry. And Henry's home was right down here on the bend. And it doesn't show on this map. And we're going to talk about the story of how he lost all his crops at that farm. But he lives right next door to his brother, Samuel. Samuel's property is also well known because that's where Clara Barton set up her hospital after the Battle of Antietam. This is another ancestor of mine. This is another great-grandfather, and his name was Martin Van Buren Adams. No guessing what his politics were, named for the president, Martin Van Buren. One of the things that happened that day, I heard all the family stories, and I remembered some of them. And one of the stories came down that this was my grandmother's grandparent, Martin and Isabel Adams. And they sent their horses to family relatives in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, when they knew that the Confederate Army and the Union Army were coming. They got their horses out of there, got their livestock out of there. I mentioned Samuel Poffenberger a moment ago, where Clara Barton set up her hospital. And his family, they couldn't get the horses out, but they took the horses, 8 of them, into the cellar of their house, and they tied feed sacks onto their hooves so that that would muffle the noise, hoping that that would save their horses. And another story my grandfather told me that day was that his great-grandfather, a Bloom, he was a toll gate keeper on the turnpike, and the troops came up, the Confederate troops came up, and he put the toll gate down and wanted to charge the whole Confederate Army toll to pass through. And I looked for that story for 25 years and could never find it. I read everything I could find on the Antietam campaign. I never found it. And one night, I belonged to the Civil War Roundtable, the Pipe Creek Civil War Roundtable. We had a book raffle, and I won a book, Henry Kidd Douglas's memoir, I Rode with Stonewall. And one night, I'm up late reading it, and I read the passage that tells the story. And it turned out to be true. But what I didn't know is it took place during the Gettysburg campaign, not the Antietam campaign. That's why I didn't find it. But I want to read you the story that Henry Kidd Douglas had written. He said, En route to Hagerstown that day, at the head of the column, was suddenly halted by a novel obstacle. Old John Bloom, the toll gatherer, stepped out of his toll house and he says, "Who's going to pay the toll for all these horses and wagons I see coming?" So Douglas, who knew him, he says, "I am, Mr. Bloom." He said, "I'll give you an order on President Davis. You take it to Richmond and get the money." So Mr. Bloom, my ancestor, Jeff Davis, I'll see him blank. But he says, "Look here." He says, "You're running this crowd, are you? We'll go along." He threw up the gate and he said, "I don't know how long I could stop your army at this old toll gate." So what's interesting then is John Bloom is written up later in Douglas's memoir. And he says, well, he wasn't a true loyal Union man, because he told me after the war that when he stopped our army on its way to Gettysburg, he said, "It had better taken my advice and gone back to Virginia." Well, he named his son, his middle name Lee, and that's where Lee enters the family when John Bloom names his son. Now onto the battlefield. This is the famous sunken road as it was known locally. It became known as Bloody Lane. And part of the family tradition that there were some artifacts found on the battlefield, in the battlefield, and I'm going to present those now. And one of those was said to come from this area. This is what it looked like shortly after the battle. You still have Confederate dead who have yet to be buried. We also have a picture of a federal burial detail. And this comes a quote from Lieutenant Joshua Fayville, the 57th New York. He was put in charge of a burial detail, and he gives exactly what it was like, and my ancestors are part of the people he's talking about. He says, "The country people flocked to the battlefield like vultures, their curiosity and inquisitiveness most astonishing. While my men were all at work, many of them stood around, dazed and awestruck by the terrible evidence of the great fight. Hundreds were scattered over the field, eagerly searching for souvenirs in the shape of cannonballs, guns, swords, canteens, etc." So this is the exact scene he's talking about, how they're burying the dead, and the country people, my ancestors and others, are running around the battlefield picking up souvenirs, and we'll talk about a few of those. This is a picture of Henry Poffenberger and his wife Martha. This is a daguerreotype taken about the time they were married in the mid-1850s. And I can remember being at my grandmother's house. You saw her in the old country store. And a woman sent this picture to her in the mail, this daguerreotype from the 1850s, and said, "This is your ancestor. I thought maybe you'd like to have it." And she was just so overjoyed to see a picture of her grandparents. She'd never seen it before. And it was interesting survival because it had gone down in the family to a youngest daughter. They had remarried. It went out of the family, and it happened 2 generations in a row that it ended up in the youngest daughter as a part of a second marriage child. And she was totally unrelated to the family, but she tracked my grandmother down and returned that picture in the early 1970s. So it's a real treasure to have. As I say, this was probably taken about the time of their wedding in 1855. One of the things my grandfather had was a wooden ammunition chest, and this is something he gave me at that 1962 event, and I've treasured it all these years. And when I was in graduate school, we had a conservation program there, and one of my fellow students decided to take it on as a conservation project. This is as it's completed. It was totally filthy. And what she did, they're real amazing people, conservators. She made this image, and this is a composite image where she used natural light, infrared, and then X-ray because the paint was based on lead. And instead of a whole black surface, you were revealing the letters of the original stenciling that was on the box. And then she created a stencil out of a special plastic mylar. And then she took underneath a vapor hood, because she was working with ether and hydrogen peroxide in 50% of each solution. And when she dabbed that on where the stencil was, a letter appeared. It was like magic. It was really amazing to watch her work on that in the lab. So that was a chemical reaction that she was able to reverse all that oxidation from years past. And you notice in the next slide, this white accretion at the bottom. She was able to do a chemical analysis of that and found it was potassium nitrate, which is a primary component of black powder, which would have been in the cartridges. This carried 1,000 rounds of cartridges for the soldiers. They would be handed these cartridges, put in their cartridge box before a battle. She also analyzed the dust that was inside the box, and was found to be cornstarch. And we concluded that that was part of the glue used to make the cartridges. So fascinating project, and I'm lucky to have a box that went through all that. Well, what was really interesting is we always thought that it was from the 1862 campaign. And just recently, I've been corresponding with a historian who's found about a dozen of these surviving boxes. That's all that's left. And he dates it to sometime in 1863 by the construction. So we now know it wasn't at Antietam, but it is an original box from the time period. This is a musket that my grandfather gave me. It was made in England, and it was one that was used heavily on both sides by the Union and the Confederate armies. It's called an Enfield, pattern 1853, and they were imported, again, for both sides. I'll take a close-up of the lock. Maybe a little hard to see, but right here where I'm circling, it says 1862 and Tower. And my grandfather thought that it had come from somewhere around the Bloody Lane. I showed you that picture earlier. And I found a soldier who served in the 4th New York Infantry, and he wrote to the New York Sunday Mercury newspaper a few weeks after the battle. And he said, many of the arms picked up on the field proved to be of English pattern and to have been manufactured this year, 1862, in London. To come into the possession of the rebels, they must have run the blockade. So this soldier who's writing from the 4th New York, they were one of the company, or the regiments, excuse me, who was involved in the Bloody Lane. So this musket may well be one that he's describing, that they were picking up other ones of exactly the same pattern after the battle. This is a second musket. This is an American-made one. It's an 1842 Springfield. And this was another one that came home. And if we take a look at the lock, it says Springfield 1849 and has a U.S. Eagle on it. This was an obsolete arm by the time of Antietam, but a lot of these were carried by Confederates because they just didn't have better arms. And I think this one does have an original Confederate history. What was exciting was there was carving in the stock, and many soldiers would put their initials to identify their musket. And we can see 3 big, large block letters, A, F, H. And then somewhat hastily, it looks like A, T, C, H. And for a long time, I thought right here at the end was a T. And I looked at this for years trying to find someone of H or O-T-C-H-T or H-A. And there wasn't anybody in the Civil War. Everything looked period. And finally, one day I was examining it and I just held it in the right light. And I could tell that both of these scratches here were made much later. They were much later scratches. They hadn't anything to do with the inscription. So it's Hatch, H-A-T-C-H, A-F Hatch. So in doing research about Civil War soldiers, there were only 2 of them that ever served in the Civil War, both in the Union Army, and by coincidence, both of them served at Antietam. So Hatch was in the 77th New York. Ellenson F. Hatch was a sergeant. And the area that he fought in, this is back to the family. Here's the Poffenberger farm at the top. That's Sam's farm. The D. Miller is actually misidentified. Michael Miller lived in this farm. And my ancestors' farm was right here, and there is no house showing at this point. And we'll get to that story of why there's no house on the battlefield now. It's gone. But the 77th New York was here in the northern part of the battlefield, and they were coming down the Smoketown Road, and their objective was the old Dunker Church. And there's a high ground right here, and they make it somewhere in this area, and then the Confederates are over here in the woods, and they fire into them. And they do take some casualties, but then they fall back, and we'll show you a little bit of that. I guess about 20 yards, this is a Confederate battery. This is a chest here. These are unfortunately Confederate deads. And this is the Dunker Church. You see how it sits on a high little part of ground here. And then this part of ground here is also high. So the 77th New York with Sergeant Hatch came up from the right of our picture here. And then the Confederates were in this woods behind the Dunker Church and poured a devastating fire into them. And this Confederate battery was just in the process of unlimbering and was going to fire into them almost at point blank range. They're just almost to the right here. And the General Irwin had seen them and sent someone forward to tell them to fall back before they'd be destroyed. So they fell back over the rise here. And then this Confederate battery was destroyed in the battle. And the 77th was basically out of the fight. And after that, they went out. They had about 35 killed, I believe, and they were taking care of their killed and wounded. They're also doing a little souvenir hunting. And that's when I think that Sergeant Hatch picks up the musket and scratches his initials into it. So after the battle, the 77th goes into camp, and I want to read you a little bit of story about what that looks like. This is a illustration out of John D. Billings' Hardtack and Coffee, or the Unwritten Story of Army Life, published in 1887. If you haven't read it, it's a wonderful story about soldiering in the Civil War. He describes what it's like to go into camp. He says, one of the most interesting scenes presented in Army life took place at night when the Army was on the point of bivouacking. As soon as this fact became known along the column, each man would seize a rail from the nearest fence, with his additional arm on his shoulder, would enter the camping ground. In no more time than it takes to tell the story, the little campfires, rapidly increasing to hundreds in number, would shoot up along the hills and plains as if by magic. Acres would be luminous with them. Soon they would be surrounded by the soldiers, who made it an almost invariable rule to cook their coffee first, after which a large number, tired out from the toils of the day, would make their supper of hardtack and coffee and roll up in their blankets for the night. And we see this fellow right here in the center. He's got his fence rail. That's one of the things that the farmers that we're going to talk about, one of the things they lost were all their fencing as well as their crops. This is the northern part of the battlefield. I mentioned Jake Poffenberger before. He's one generation back beyond my great-great-grandfather Henry. His property extended across this line here, which is the Hagerstown Turnpike, and then back here almost to Bakersville. What's really interesting is the 77th New York, they go to Williamsport a few miles away, and then a few days later, they bring them back and they camp right here in Bakersville. They may actually have camped right on Jacob Poffenberger's farm on the back side here, on the west side of the Hagerstown Turnpike. We'll never know that, but the musket comes into the family, and it seems likely that that's how it came in, is because he couldn't take it with him. This is, unfortunately, Ellenson Hatch's certificate of disability, and he was discharged because he was sick, and he went home to Boston Spa, New York, and unfortunately, a few days after he arrived home, he died of disease. So we know he didn't take the musket with him because it stayed in Washington County and was somehow retrieved by one of my ancestors. Another item that's very intriguing is an old silver pocket watch. The glass is broken, the hands are bent. There was a ring here, it's gone. This is a heavily damaged watch. And when we look inside, there's an interesting story here. This purports to be an American watch, but it's actually a European knockoff, probably made in Switzerland. And we see, instead of Waltham, Massachusetts, we see Waldham, Massachusetts. And instead of Bartlett, who was the watchmaker, it's Bartlett. So someone has, it's a fake. It's like a fake Swiss watch. And these were sold to soldiers. So my speculation is this is something that was sold to a soldier. It was dropped on the battlefield. The time may be interesting. We don't know if it's AM or PM, but found on the northern part of the battlefield. Hooker launched his attack a little bit after 5. So this would be in the first hour of the battlefield, if indeed it was stopped at that time. Now, this is a close-up of the area where they lived. I mentioned earlier the D. Miller. Well, I'll have a great quote from him later. It's really Michael Miller. And then here's Sam Poffenberger, where Clara Barton puts up her property at the hospital. And then right below it, in the bend in the road, was where my ancestor lived. But what he did is he sold his farm, and he sold it to his brother's father-in-law. And that was Mr. Daub. And then that made a larger farm for his daughter and son-in-law, Sam Poffenberger. And then my ancestor moves about 6 miles, and that is the property I showed you with the old country store and the railroad tracks. That's the property that he moves to. So he sells in March of 1862. The battle doesn't happen until September of 1862. But all of the crops that he had planted that year, that was his whole year of livelihood as a farmer. So everything he had invested in that year was going to be harvested that fall. In fact, it was in the process of being harvested by his brother Sam. That was the deal he made when he sold the property. So all the crops are his. The land now belongs to his brother. So this is Jake Poffenberger. This is the toll road, and these are the Millers. And then this little property down below, we think is the property that he had. This is the property where he moved to in March of 1862. This building here I'm circling, that's the old country store. He has a brick farmhouse over here. The railroad tracks run between these two properties right here. The railroad tracks I played on run right between those two properties. And unfortunately for my ancestor, during the Gettysburg campaign, the Union Army also comes through that area and they take everything again. So this is an affidavit that I found at the National Archives, and he is claiming $800.27 as his damages for those things that were taken. And this is a listing of the personal effects that he claims that he lost, everything with an appraised value. And some of these will make sense, and in other ones you just have to wonder why the soldiers took them. But they took 40 pounds of brown sugar, worth $4 a pound. They took 5 fine quilts. They took 2 silk dresses. Don't know what they were going to do with those. They took a suit of men's cashmere clothing. They took a half a dozen silver teaspoons. They also stole the large family Bible. So we don't have our family Bible from the Poffenberger family because it was stolen during the Gettysburg campaign. Well, he wanted to get reimbursed, like most farmers who were damaged. This is his first claim, and he files a claim with the Quartermaster Department of the Army in 1873. So we're 10 years after his losses, and he's filing this claim, both for his Antietam losses, all the crops that were in the field, and then all of this property that was taken during the Gettysburg campaign. So he has 2 separate claims. And this is a slide of his testimony. And they were asking him, what's your age, what's your occupation, and were you a loyal man, and did you vote, and so forth. Then they asked him, well, how did you sell this property, and how did you own it? And then Henry's attorney writes back, and he says in his written statement, and he said they were used by the U.S. Army. No receipt or voucher was given because, quote, it was customary at the time, and owing to the excitement and confusion attending to the Battle of Antietam, no pay or compensation was made. So that's where the quote comes from. It's out of Henry's attorney's statement to the court. Every good history story, I think, has a villain, and this is our villain. The gentleman on the left, this Army colonel, name's Victor Vifquain. And then there's a document on the right that I found at the National Archives, and it's called a relinquishment of claim. And after the war, Vifquain and my ancestor, Henry Poffenberger, they met to discuss his claim, and he convinced him to sign this document. He didn't understand it, but he signed it. But a little bit of the story, he's a fascinating fellow. Vifquain was born in Belgium, and he moved to the United States in 1857 and settles in Nebraska. When the war breaks out, he gets commissioned in a New York infantry regiment composed mainly of French Americans, and they're discontinued in March of 62. It was an unruly regiment. So in the spring of 1862, he and 2 other men concoct a plan to end the war early by going to Richmond and kidnapping President Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. And he goes down, and they spend several months trying to kidnap him. They fail. They come back home, and he joins another regiment. And in late 1865, April 1865, he's at the Battle of Fort Blakely, Alabama. And you can see in this image, he's wearing a medal. It's the Medal of Honor, which he did earn. And I'll tell you how he earned it. They assault Fort Blakely. He and the color bearer of his regiment, the 97th Illinois, they arrive at the Confederate flagpole. He takes out his sword and he cuts the rope, which drops the flag. And this large fort flag lands on top of his head and covers his complete body. The color bearer becomes the target. He's immediately shot and killed, but Vifquain survives. He certainly is, in that time period, they would have called him a man with a lot of pluck. But anyway, he convinces my ancestors to sign this document, and we'll talk about that a little later. It does cause him trouble in the end. Now, in 1877, they look at the claim, and the Quartermaster Department reviews and says, there's no evidence that you had a document that said these were used by the Union Army. Of course, he didn't have any document. He wasn't there, and they weren't giving out any documents. So this is Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs, and his report in 1877 says, I'm unable to certify as required by the Act of July 4th, 1864. I'm convinced that these stores were taken and used by the Union Army. So essentially, Henry didn't have a receipt, so he lost his case in 1878. There's a second case, and this is really a neat document. I came across this at the National Archives. It's the cover document for his case, number 7178. It tells you how many farmers had gone to court with the United States. I used, like a lot of people, Googling people's names, my own, other people's in the family. And I put Henry A. Poffenberger in one time just to see what would come up. And the first hit was a government publication from the late 19th century. It was Henry A. Poffenberger versus the United States of America. My first thought was, what in the world did Henry do to get hauled into federal court? That's a story that hadn't come down in the family. But what it was his congressional case. We'll talk about that here last. This is a case that he entered in 1889. And what had happened was Congress had recognized that there were so many farmers, many of them now prominent in their communities. They had political clout. And they had convinced the Congress to pass new legislation, the Bellman and Tucker Acts. This provided a way for a citizen to petition Congress to have their case heard in the U.S. Court of Claims. So you didn't have a receipt, but you had a case. You could go to court if you could get your local congressman to sponsor a bill. And that's what Henry did, like many of the farmers in Washington County whose properties were damaged during the Antietam campaign. So this is Quartermaster General Samuel Hollibird and the report. And he writes back, he said, well, all I can say is I found the same thing that Quartermaster General Meigs found. And I don't have any proof that it was used by the Army. So now it goes to 1895. He finally gets his day in court. And a preliminary inquiry found that Henry was loyal to the government. They did another question and answer. And this is his statement of his case. And in 1898, now it took another 3 years for him to finally present his case, starting in 1889. And then now 98, he's finally presenting his case of what his losses were. And the Antietam and Gettysburg campaign losses totaled over $1,260. And just out of curiosity, I wanted to try to compute what was that in today's dollars, perhaps. So one measurement was the value of gold. So in 1863, his $1,200 would have bought 67 ounces of gold. And at today's value, when I looked at it on the computer, it's about $118,000. So it's not an insignificant sum for a farmer to lose. This is his list of things that are typed up in the National Archives. It's interesting, we saw the one from 1865 that was handwritten. Now all the court material from the late 19th century is all typed. So he talks about the bushels of wheat, he talks about the rye and the corn and so forth. And that was taken by General McClellan's army. At the top here is at the Antietam campaign, and then other things taken during the Battle of the Gettysburg campaign after Gettysburg in July of 1863. And he claimed no claim, had never been paid for anything. And this, I want to read you this passage. It's a little long, but I think you'll find it interesting. I mentioned a couple times that D. Miller was the wrong. It's really Michael Miller. Well, he was an 81-year-old neighbor, lived next to Samuel Poffenberger. And this was his testimony. He says, I'm 81 years old, reside in Hagerstown, Maryland. I'm a retired farmer. Not interested in this claim, and I'm not related to the claimant. I lived about 500 yards from Henry A. Poffenberger in the year 1862. I saw his supplies taken by the Union Army at that time. In the fall of the year 1862, after the Battle of Antietam, I saw part of General McClellan's army on his premises where they fed his wheat to their horses. This wheat was in the stack or rick and was fed in the straw. My wheat was fed in the same manner at the same time. I do not know how many bushels were taken. I have this day examined the appraisement. He goes into all the honest men who did the appraisement. He says, I believe it true and correct. They were all good men. And then what I really like at the end, he says, I got paid for my wheat by the Quartermaster Department General under the Act of July 4th, 1864. It was taken at the same time and the same troops in the same manner. And that was the compelling evidence. I think Henry won his case. But this document I mentioned earlier that our villain, Colonel Vifquain, he talked him into relinquishing his Gettysburg campaign claim. So in the testimony that's at the National Archives, this is what Henry said under cross-examination. He says, I have never relinquished either of these claims to the United States. I find my signature to such a paper, and right there it is, Henry A. Poffenberger. But I have no recollection of the circumstances under which it was done. Because he signed this in 1875, and it's a full 20 years later. He was an agent of the United States, and I supposed he would treat me fairly and justly. And I signed the paper on his statement that it was right for me to do so. He says, I don't recollect the circumstances and so forth. Then Henry's attorney writes in, he said, when the quartermaster's agent was investigating these two claims, he endeavored to take advantage of the claimant by getting him to sign the relinquishment of one claim by the assurance that doing so would facilitate the settlement of the other claim. I do not deem it necessary to make any comment on such conduct, and I will make no further comment on what he did. But he did lose his case. This is the final document in our story. The court did find that he was due about $400, $491. And I wonder, after 36 years of legal fees, going to Washington, D.C. to make testimony, bringing his old neighbor, Mr. Miller, down there and taking care of all the hotel bills, whether he ended up with anything whatsoever. But we can see a little bit of what happened to him. This is an account book which I have, and he started this in August of 1863. It's a double entry, the debts of this Cornelius Ridenauer, who's one of his customers, are on the left-hand column, and then all the credits are done on the right-hand. This is a typical double entry ledger from the 19th century. So every time they did business together, he would record it in here. So he's getting bushels of wheat, he's selling them in, and he gets $10 in cash. So at the end, there $86 was the bill between the two men. So he was back on his feet. He had that little store, which grew into the country store I played in as a child. And that building still stands in St. James, Maryland. The railroad tracks are still there. And we go back there at least once a summer and spend a little time around the old property. It brings back a lot of great memories, a lot of good stories that I learned starting in 1962. So this is Henry and Martha. This is them about 1890, maybe a little later, about the time of his case in the 1890s. They had 8 children, all survived. They retired and lived in Hagerstown. Martha Jane, his wife, died in 1900, and Henry, on September 15th, just 2 days before the anniversary of the Battle of Antietam in 1901. That brings me to the end of my story, and I think we have time for questions.
Yes, thank you, Jay. That's a great story. Loved all the little details. That's fantastic. I trust everyone enjoyed that. So we do have time to take a few questions. And again, to ask questions via Zoom, you can raise your hand or use the chat box feature. To raise your hand, move your mouse to the bottom of the Zoom window and your menu will appear. Tap on the participant button and that'll bring up a list of participants. At the bottom of the participant list, you'll see a little raise hand box. Looks like that. Click on that and you'll see a dialog box asking you to allow us to unmute you. Approve and your mic will be unmuted so you can ask a question. Or you could use the chat box feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen to type in your question, which I'll read out loud. In chat, you could send a message to everyone or use the pull-down menu to send a message to a single participant. So let's see. Have any questions? I guess how unique was your great-great-grandfather's story? Is this a common occurrence that people had years and years of legal fights to get their, made whole by the government?
Yeah, I think it was very typical in every place in Maryland, at least, where the Union Army came through. You saw my ancestor's case was 7,178, I think was the case number. So there were 7,000 other farmers across the country who were doing it. It also probably happened to some farmers here in Carroll County. If you're in the northern part of Carroll County where the Army passed through during the Gettysburg campaign, I'm sure there are cases that were similar. They weren't battles, but they were troop movements coming through there where they would take the fence rails, they would take the crops for feed for the horses and so forth. So one of the historians, battlefield guides I know at Gettysburg, talked to me about this years ago, and he said that's one of the ways he's researched some of the battle sites in Gettysburg is to go to National Archives and pull the cases for those farmers. There are details in there about who was in what field and on what piece of property. So it happened in all the northern states. Obviously in the southern states, you wouldn't get that. But I think there were probably 10,000 or more farmers in that predicament. How many of them stuck it out for all those years, we don't know. But at least in that last case, there was over 7,000 who were having active cases in the U.S. Court.
Right. Now we have a question coming in. Any idea how your family managed with 2 lost years in a row?
I think they were lucky in one sense. They were farmers, so they could always grow crops. They didn't lose everything. And Henry, especially being a storekeeper, that was a good living. And a lot of it was barter. So people had whatever they had excess. So you'll see in the ledger book, they'll be taking farm produce, animals, pork, beef, chickens, all those kinds of things, and making a living at that. And my grandfather, he was, I guess, the third generation there in that store, and made a very good living. He even survived the Depression, although he always told me during the Depression he almost went broke because he gave away food to families who couldn't pay. And I remember as a kid in the 1970s, a man came into the store and he wanted to give my grandfather $50. It looked like the only $50 he had. And he said, "You gave that to my family in the 30s, and I want to pay it back. I finally can do that." But that's the kind of people they were. And in a small town like that, a small community, the store was one of the centers of community life, that and the church. And a store was a way to survive. A lot of people did lose their properties, and he was lucky he didn't lose it.
Another question came in: were the horses found or not?
The horses found, they were. Yeah. The Sam Poffenberger farm, as I mentioned, Clara Barton sets up her hospital there. I don't know if they were lost, but they were certainly found. But that whole house was taken over as a hospital. And Sam and I know Henry must have, they went to their father's property, Jacob, which was just north of there that I showed you. And their property wasn't touched. So they spent I think it was about 3 weeks that Sam's property was occupied by Union troops. So, yeah.
All right, do we have any other questions for Jay? All right, going once and twice. Well, thank you, Jay. This was a great story, and thank you for your time tonight. We really appreciate it. Welcome.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you. It's good to be with everybody virtually, and I hope in the future we'll be together in reality. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. As most of you know, we typically charge an entrance fee for our talks at the Tavern of $3 for members and $7 for non-members. If you enjoyed this presentation, please go to our homepage, hsccmd.org, and on the top right-hand side, click on the donate button and donate any amount you wish. Small gifts add up to make a big difference. And thank you again. And just a couple of announcements. The Historical Society will be hosting 2 virtual events in July for our box lunch talk on June 21st at noon. Doug Heck will be talking about the history of the Town Historical Museum, including the 2020 baseball exhibit, which I hope they're still putting together, and the museum's future plans. And for our virtual talk of the Tavern at 7 p.m. on June 23rd, Master Gardener Linda Broadfoot will talk about the renovated herb gardens behind Shellman House and discuss historic Pennsylvania German practices. Registration for both events are now available on our website under the events page. So I hope everyone is staying safe, and best wishes for continued good health, and have a great evening. Thanks very much for joining us.